Chapter 6. Eleanor did not remember how she got here. The last clear thing she remembered was Hawthorne's pulse under her fingers, thin and irregular, and Thad's voice somewhere behind her saying, "Silent protocol," as the lights went out. After that came fragments that refused to arrange themselves into sequence. The smell of disinfectant, a pressure band behind her eyes, the sensation of being guided by the elbow through endless spaces. Artificial heat, the smell of cheap aftershave, a voice telling her to keep her head down. Another voice had said her name as if confirming it matched a record. Now she was properly awake. She looked around a room that was narrow and white, with no visible fixtures beyond the bed, and a recessed panel in the ceiling that might have concealed a light, a camera, or both. She lay still for a moment, trying to make herself feel more conscious in the here and now. Her shoulder ached. An uncomfortable dryness at the back of her throat made swallowing difficult. Trying to think back produced nothing but blurry flashes, incomplete pictures. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and waited for the instant dizziness to subside. No one came. After a time she stood, testing the floor for vibration, listening for sound beyond the walls. There was nothing. No hum of machinery, no voices, no distant traffic. If she was underground again, it was deeper than before. Eventually, a man arrived, opening the door without ceremony. Eleanor was shocked to think she hadn't heard it being unlocked. She hadn't even thought to try it to see if she was a prisoner. This man wore civilian clothing, with a state-issued badge pinned to his lapel, and carried a tablet. "Dr. Davies," he said. "Not a question." She nodded. "I'm Dr. Haynes, occupational medicine. How are you feeling?" "Fine," Eleanor said. It was the easiest answer to give when all she wanted was to know what was going on. He made a small sound of acknowledgement and gestured for her to sit. She did. He did not. The questions that followed were careful and curiously incomplete. He asked about her sleep, her appetite, her recollection of events. He did not ask about Hawthorne. He did not ask about the underground facility, or the explosion, or the men who had helped her escape. He did not ask why she had run. At one point he checked her pupils with a penlight, then her reflexes, then her blood pressure. His hands were cool and efficient. He never touched her longer than necessary. "How long were you held?" he asked, eyes on the tablet now. "I don't know," Eleanor said. This, at least, was true. So the story was that she'd been kidnapped by the resistance and held against her will, was it? That must mean Dr. Haynes was part of the deception. She couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust anyone. He accepted her answer without comment. When he finished, he set the tablet aside and folded his hands. "There will be an official record," he said. "You'll be briefed on it shortly. For now, you should understand that you are not under investigation." Not under investigation, Eleanor thought, and wondered what had happened to General Hawthorne when the lights went out. Was that what Dr. Haynes meant? Eleanor looked up at him. "What about my official day job? I disappeared from my post at the hospital." "Yes," he said, "and you'll return to it." "I will." His mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "You were taken by dissident elements. You escaped during a relocation attempt. You survived due to a combination of professional awareness and good fortune." "And the people who took me?" "Untraceable," he said, "or deceased." She waited, but he did not elaborate. "You'll be reinstated," he went on, "with certain annotations." "What kind of annotations?" "Non-clinical," he said smoothly. "You won't need to access them." She held his gaze. He did not look away. God knows what that meant then. She'd be flagged as a troublemaker, maybe. "You're advised to rest for a short period," he continued. "Avoid public statements, avoid unscheduled contact, cooperate with follow-up assessments. Your specialty remains valuable. You'll resume limited duties once clearance is complete." Clearance? What did that mean exactly? When he left, Eleanor sat back on the bed, exhausted again. She understood then that the resistance had controlled her movements far more than she'd previously appreciated. Whatever bargains had been made, they had been made elsewhere, without her presence. She had not been rescued. She had been returned to the state. The hospital looked the same. Her hospital. The one she'd worked at so willingly for so long. The one above ground. When she walked back through the staff entrance 2 days later, her ID newly activated, her name restored to the rota, it was all just the same as when she'd left it. Except she imagined her name had a few flags on it now that she would not be privy to. The floors were still polished to a dull shine, the walls the same neutral green, chosen to suggest calm rather than cleanliness. The coffee machine in the break room still produced something brown and bitter that everyone drank anyway. What had changed was the way people looked at her. No one asked where she had been. Conversations paused when she entered a room, then resumed with careful neutrality. A registrar she had mentored for years smiled too brightly and immediately excused herself. A consultant she knew well merely nodded once and did not meet her eyes again. Even Dr. Alan Morecombe, her colleague from the Department of Virology, barely looked at her. He did at least greet her. "Glad to see you back," he said before disappearing down the corridor. Maybe he didn't know she'd used his login for nefarious purposes. She wondered if he'd changed his password. She was assigned a reduced caseload, observation only for the first week. Review notes, attend ward rounds, offer opinions when asked. She would comply. Compliance, she was learning, was a form of camouflage. On the third day back, she noticed the supplements. They were issued alongside the morning medications, small white capsules in unmarked blister packs. The nurses distributed them without comment. Patients swallowed them without question. In the notes, they were listed under nutritional support, flagged as non-essential. Eleanor asked about them once, lightly. "New guidance," the nurse said, shrugging. "Post-viral support." Eleanor made no reply. She just kept watching. The changes were not dramatic. That was what unsettled her most. A regular patient who always argued fiercely about everything now deferred without discussion. A woman who had wept daily over her prognosis listened with a small smile on her otherwise blank face as Eleanor explained the next steps, then merely nodded, hands folded neatly in her lap. It was not like they'd been sedated. They weren't confused. It was something else. It was as if they'd been flattened, Eleanor thought. Smoothed out. She wrote careful notes, kept her questions neutral. She reminded herself to think, as her father would have said. "Think, Nell. Look at the pattern. The summons came at the end of the week. It was delivered in the same manner as everything else now. A message on her terminal, phrased as a request she knew was an instruction. Consultation, assessment, Central Research Institute. Yes, after a heavy blink, the name was still there. Central Research Institute. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Thad had wanted her to infiltrate this high-security bioweapons facility. Was this his doing, or someone else's? At the institute, the air was cooler, the light brighter. There were no armed guards in sight, no raised voices, no sense of urgency. Doors opened as she approached them. Her badge was accepted without question. "You're expected," a woman said, meeting her at the entrance to a long corridor. "Your work on post-VF autoimmune dysregulation has been reviewed." Reviewed. Eleanor noted the past tense. Reviewed as if some decision based on her work had already been made. They walked together, the woman's stride unhurried, her tone conversational. She spoke of overlaps between disciplines, of the need for integrated thinking, of the value of clinicians who understood both systems and bodies. She did not mention Genesis. As they passed a glass-walled office, Eleanor caught sight of a document open on a desk. She slowed without meaning to. It wasn't the heading that caught her attention, but what followed, the way the problem was framed before any evidence was shown, with warnings placed early to shut down criticism rather than invite discussion. She had seen that before. Not in the scientific literature or the textbooks she studied for so long, but at the kitchen table, years ago, listening to her father dismantle an argument she had thought sound by asking which people it assumed could be lost when she had been trying to lose no one. Her stomach tightened. It must be coincidence. Her father was long gone, as were so many others. And yet the logic was unmistakable. Not wrong, not careless, just utterly uninterested in whether anyone had consented to the risks it imposed. "Think, Nell." The voice came unbidden, as it always did when something important was there for her to see, but remained just out of her sight. She did not look back at the document as the woman guided her onward, and her escort did not remark on Eleanor's hesitation. She continued walking, her pace unchanged, as if Eleanor had not slowed at all. The corridor widened into a space that was neither office nor laboratory. furnished sparsely with pale seating and low tables that held nothing more than terminals in sleep mode. There were no notices on the walls, no posters, no reminders of protocol. "You'll be working here initially," the woman said. "It's a transitional space, for orientation." Orientation. Eleanor took in the word. Not induction, not assessment. Orientation assumed she already belonged where they had put her. She was shown a workstation, not a temporary terminal wheeled in for her use, but a built-in desk with her name already logged on the screen. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting. Eleanor did not touch it. "I haven't agreed to anything yet," she said, thinking as she uttered the words that it was such a feeble objection, given the circumstances, that it was barely worth the effort. The woman inclined her head slightly. Of course. She did not step back. Eleanor sat anyway, aware that refusal here was futile and not worth the black mark it would put on her records. She looked around. Glass partitions segmented the space, but the glass was subtly treated, blurring detail beyond a certain distance. She could see people moving, but not what they were doing. She wondered if they could see her more clearly. "You're not under restriction," the woman said, as if reading her thoughts. "Your access will expand as needed." "As needed by whom?" Eleanor asked. "By the work," she replied. She didn't add, obviously, but she might as well have. That answer unsettled Eleanor more than any display of authority might have. She had spent her career negotiating hierarchies, understanding power flows in hospitals and committees and research bodies. This was different. The work was positioned not as a task, but as an inevitability. A screen to her left activated, displaying a schedule. Her name appeared twice in the next 3 days. "You were expecting me," Eleanor said. "Yes." The woman moved on then, leaving Eleanor alone with the quiet hum of systems she could not see. She waited a moment before interacting with the terminal, long enough to note the way the room failed to settle once she was alone. No sense of privacy descended along with her solitude, no shift in atmosphere. She was being watched. Of that, she was now certain. She touched the screen. The interface was spare. No welcome message, no explanatory overlays, just files, neatly arranged, some grayed out, others already accessible. She scrolled slowly, resisting the urge to open anything yet. Her eye caught on a folder marked Post-Viral Variants, Clinical Integration. Beneath it, a subheading she recognized from her own work. This was her work. She closed the screen without opening the folder and leaned back in the chair, forcing herself to breathe evenly. That was her work on their system, on the Institute's system. Without warning, a memory intruded. Thad, standing too close in the underground hospital, lowering his voice even though the walls were thick. "You won't get another chance like this." At the time, she had thought he meant the chance to do something significant, something for the good of the society they lived in. Now she wondered just what he had meant. She had not heard from him since waking. Maybe he couldn't reach her here. That absence pressed at her more than she expected. It was not fear for his safety so much, but the knowledge that whatever remained of the resistance was no longer moving in step with her. Or she was not moving in step with it. She had been peeled away from it, cleanly and efficiently. A notification appeared in the corner of the screen. A system update, routine. She dismissed it without reading, then paused, reconsidered, and opened it. External medical assets redeployed. Off-grid clinical sites decommissioned. Thad, it must be. Did it mean the underground hospital had been relocated successfully? She would cling to that hope. She closed the notification and sat very still. Greg's face came to her then, uninvited, not as he was at the end of her before-now memories, running, breathless, eyes too bright, but earlier, leaning against a doorway, hands shoved into his pockets, as if he had all the time in the world. She wondered, suddenly, whether he had ever been as free as he appeared. She wondered what would happen to his daughter now, the daughter with liver issues. Another message appeared. Again, the sender field was blank, alive, limited. Don't reply unless essential. Of course, it was Thad. Relief flared, brief and sharp, followed immediately by anger. Limited meant constrained, watched, managed. It meant he was unable to speak freely. It meant that whatever he had known, whatever he had not told her, was now locked away from her behind the same layers that constrained him. She typed a single word. Hawthorne? but then she deleted it in case that was enough to betray him somehow. Whatever had happened to the general would not be communicated this way. When she went back, she didn't open the clinical folders. She chose the institutional overview, a summary designed to explain the system without raising alarms. She read it slowly, paying attention to the wording and to what was missing. It never said control. It said stability. It never said compliance. It said standardization. It never said weapon or acknowledged that the system could be used as one. She closed her eyes briefly, hearing again her father's voice, measured and patient, asking which people were being smuggled into the argument as acceptable losses. When she opened her eyes again, she hitched herself up to sit straighter. She placed her hands back on the keyboard and opened the first file. When the data appeared, it did so without preamble, dropping her into the middle of a long-term analysis she recognized instantly. She frowned, leaning closer to the screen. The group criteria were familiar: age ranges, other illnesses, how severe the original ViroFlux infection had been, how long recovery took. Even the exclusions matched what she had argued for in her early papers, when existing autoimmune disease had risked muddying already uncertain results. She scrolled. There it was. A model she had built herself, years ago, adapted and expanded far beyond its original scope. She recognized the assumptions embedded in it, the tolerances, the statistical compromises made when human biology refused to behave cleanly. Back then, she had annotated them heavily, flagging uncertainties, arguing for caution. Here, those annotations had been absorbed into the framework and rendered invisible. She moved through the files more quickly now. Her name appeared in citations, sometimes correctly attributed, sometimes folded into collective authorship, sometimes not referenced at all. It did not matter. The work was hers regardless of how it had been labelled. Alarmingly, amongst the standard works, there were also pieces here she knew she had only posted to resistance sites. How had they got here? Immune problems after ViroFlux, long-lasting inflammation, autoimmune flares triggered after the virus had cleared, recovery without real repair. She had spent years trying to convince colleagues that ViroFlux did not simply end, that surviving it wasn't the same as being well, that the immune system, once thrown into prolonged hypervigilance, did not always know how to switch itself off. Here, that understanding had been taken seriously. Too seriously. They had mapped the immune breakdown in extraordinary detail. Patterns of inflammation, thresholds where the brain tipped into overreaction, the slow weakening of the system meant to rein it all back in. She felt a familiar professional respect despite herself. The models were elegant, internally consistent, brutally well made, and then she saw what they had done with them. The immune disruption wasn't treated as something to fix. It was treated as something to adjust. Certain immune profiles were marked as unstable, linked to erratic behavior, resistance to direction, and difficulty following post-ViroFlux rules. She stopped scrolling. Variance reduction, the document called it. They weren't trying to cure immune dysfunction. They were shaping what it led to. Eleanor realized, with a slow, sinking certainty, that this was not misuse of her work. It was its logical conclusion. Well, to be fair to herself, it was not the logical conclusion. It was just one that could have come from it if the user was that way inclined, which this user was. Her earlier papers had argued that immune response and brain function couldn't be separated. Long-lasting inflammation affected thinking, mood, and judgment. She had written those lines herself, cautiously, always careful to note the difference between link and proof. Here, that caution was gone. She opened another file. It described adaptive antiviral protocols, changed formulations, altered dosing schedules, extra compounds added under the cover of nutritional supplements. She recognized the core antiviral at once, Rexo, revised and refined. She was afraid now. The antiviral had never been neutral. She had always known that. Every antiviral involved trade-offs. The only question had ever been whether the benefits were worth the cost. Here, the cost had been turned into a feature. She read on. The supplements she had seen in her hospital appeared here too, folded into a broader strategy of post-VF support. The language was careful, almost soothing: stabilization, harmonization, population-level benefit, no mention of consent. She thought again of the patients she had observed. The dulling of emotional response, the absence of distress, the way decisions slid past them without friction. At the time, she had wondered whether she was projecting, whether exhaustion had sharpened her perceptions into suspicion. Now she knew she had been underestimating the scale. A new document opened automatically. This one was older, its formatting subtly different. She read the opening paragraph and felt chilled at the phrasing. It was unmistakable. Not the words themselves, but the cadence, the way the argument unfolded. The insistence on defining acceptable losses before anyone could object to them. The deliberate narrowing of ethical scope, presented as intellectual discipline. She had heard that voice before. Not in lectures or publications, at home. Her father at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled up. "You're treating harm as all or nothing," he had said once, tapping the paper between them. "Biology doesn't work like that. It's gradual. The question isn't whether harm exists, but where you decide it becomes acceptable." She had argued with him. She remembered that clearly. She had accused him of turning people into numbers, of losing sight of individuals. He had listened, patient as ever, and then asked her which people she was already willing to lose for clearer data. The memory made her feel sick. Here, that way of thinking had been scaled up. The Institute's work was saturated with it. The same insistence on being technically honest, paired with a ruthless readiness to decide acceptable outcomes in advance. The same refusal to be sidetracked by moral questions. The same belief that stability was a good in itself. She searched the contributor list, but her father's name wasn't there. Somehow, that was worse. It suggested not omission, but irrelevance, as if his influence had become so embedded it no longer needed credit. The work had moved beyond individual authors into something institutional, something that sustained itself. Eleanor closed the file and sat very still. She had expected to find evidence of abuse, of corruption, of something clearly wrong. Instead, she had found continuity, a straight line from her own research, through her father's thinking, into a system that no longer felt the need to justify itself because it believed it was right. She understood then why no one had stopped her at the door, why her access had widened instead of narrowing, why no one had asked her to explain herself. This place didn't fear what she knew. It relied on it. A soft chime sounded, signaling an incoming message. She did not open it immediately. She needed a moment to reorder herself, to quiet the surge of professional recognition and personal revulsion. "Think, Nell," her father's voice in her head said again, infuriatingly calm. She reached for the message at last, already aware that whatever it contained would not ask her whether she agreed with what she had seen, only whether she was prepared to proceed. She opened it to find it contained a time and a location. The people this would be done to had already been chosen for her. Age ranges, exposure histories, risk flags she recognized from her own work. The very immune profiles she had spent years describing as most vulnerable to long-term immune disruption after VF. People whose bodies never quite recovered. People whose systems never fully settled back down. A note in the margin caught her eye. It was in shorthand, but she knew it meant that it was acceptable to make their decline happen faster, as long as it did not increase recorded deaths. Acceleration of decline. Acceleration of the very processes she had been warning about for years. The document did not say harm or damage or death. It did not need to. The charts showed it all very clearly. Cognitive flattening reached earlier, emotional response damped sooner. Decision-making simplified, smoothed, made more predictable. The human cost was not hidden, it was simply treated as tolerable, so long as it remained within statistically acceptable limits. People would not necessarily die faster, they would fade faster. She scrolled on. The final page had a single highlighted field, waiting. Clinical sign-off required. Her name was already entered beneath it, with a space for her signature. Her name. Around her, the Institute continued its work. No alarms, no raised voices. She thought of the underground hospital, now reduced to a line item marked redundant. Of Thad, alive but constrained. Of Greg, whose absence had barely been noted. She thought of her father at the kitchen table, insisting that harm was never binary, only tolerable or not, depending on where one chose to draw the line. This was the line. She understood, with a painful clarity, that refusal would not stop Genesis. It would only remove her from it. Someone else would sign. Someone less cautious. Someone less troubled by the subtleties she could see so clearly. The system did not need her consent. A second message arrived. Your expertise is valued. Your discretion is assumed. Eleanor stared at the words. She had believed infiltration was an act of resistance. Only now did she see what the Institute had been doing all along. It had not been testing her loyalty. It had been waiting to see where she would draw the line.